Hello, friends, and welcome to our lecture on bureaucracy. As you'll probably notice, the Wilson text spends a great deal of time on bureaucracy, and I encourage you to read that chapter very closely. James Q. Wilson was one of and perhaps the most important student of American bureaucracy in the 20th and early 21st centuries. So I encourage you to read that very carefully. There's a tremendous amount of insight there. And what we're going to attempt to do in this lecture is just really give an overview, which Wilson and our other text will supplement for the most part. We'll just give you sort of a basic introduction to bureaucracy, what it means. One way to begin to think about bureaucracy is to play sort of an image game. I'm going to throw a few terms out and think for a few seconds about what those terms mean to you instantly without reflecting too deeply, but in just more in general. One of those terms is red tape. Think about what that term means. It's almost always, as I guess it probably was with you as well, it has a negative connotation. Red tape, something that slows down the decision making. Even the use of the term bureaucrat usually has a negative sentiment associated with it too, because I think the bureaucrat is somebody who's faceless and going to keep us from moving to something that is productive and worthwhile for the country and perhaps for our families, for our states, communities. So bureaucracy itself has a very negative connotation. However, most of the work that's done in terms of the administrative work of government is done by the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy, like all of politics, is organic in the sense that it is constantly changing. The bureaucracy is, for the most part, increasing, but it's also becoming smarter as much more technology is integrated into the life and the work of the American bureaucracy. But bureaucracy is not very well liked. In fact, it's pretty disliked in American politics and American life. But there are many kinds of bureaucracy. So keep that in mind as kind of an initial point, is that there is bureaucracy in government and in the private sector. There are more than one type of government bureaucracy. There's the national bureaucracy associated with the national government that we think of the most. There's also 50 state bureaucracies with hundreds of thousands of employees in individual states in some cases, especially larger states, much fewer in smaller states. And then you have state and local government bureaucracy. That's where most people are employed in the United States that work for bureaucracy, state and local government. And that's where most people have their first encounter with bureaucracies at the state and local level, and where we have our most regular encounters with bureaucracy. We're going to spend our time looking at the national bureaucracy, the national government. American national government bureaucracy is not very well liked, as we have mentioned. The national bureaucracy is really that complex of organizations that administer the regular activities of government. We're also provided in the text with another definition of bureaucracy that I think is also important. Most American citizens, when they're surveyed, want the government to be competent, to know what it's doing, in other words, to be able to carry out those functions. They also want bureaucracy to be responsive, that when there is a concern, they want individuals to respond in a quick, efficient, and hopefully helpful manner. In the 230 plus years of American bureaucracy, we've had various types of systems. And those systems have changed. And that's very important for you to know, that we haven't always had the same sort of bureaucracy. When George Washington took office in 1789, we had a federalist system where Washington and those so closely associated with him brought many people into office. They were competent, but they were relatively unresponsive to the American people, and it brought them under some criticism. In the early 19th century, especially with the election of Andrew Jackson, we created a system called the patronage system. Patronage meaning that Jackson and others after him rewarded their political supporters with office. As we say in politics, and this is a metaphor, if you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. Now, this certainly made for a system of loyal political appointees. If you're the president, or you're the governor, or you're the mayor of a town under a patronage system, you win the election, you put your folks in the power. They're going to follow what you say. You're definitely going to be the chief executive of the operation. But there's some weaknesses. If you're with the other political party or some other political entity, then you may not get as good as same level of responsiveness. Also, in the Jacksonian era of patronage politics, those folks who voted for Jackson, the newly enfranchised, the new folks who got a chance to vote for the first time, they tended to get a lot of attention from bureaucracy. But there's a problem with appointing your friends or those who are political supporters. They may not be the most knowledgeable of public policy. They may not be the most knowledgeable of the issues. The office that was most often purely patronage in nature was the head of the post office, the postmaster general. The postmaster general really didn't have to do anything. They were a president's right-hand man. And so if you're a postmaster general in the 19th century, you basically could sit back and drink the libation of your choice and do whatever you like. It was basically a fun job, big salary, no responsibilities. And so that became a sign of the patronage system. Towards the end of the 19th century, it became very obvious that a patronage system was too flawed. It was too unresponsive, and it was doomed to fail. And that people fought not necessarily to elect their favorite officials in some case, but to elect officials that would appoint them to office and then hold that official responsible not for being successful in office and following the citizens' ideas, but appointing them. This all came to a head really in the late 19th century with the assassination of President James Garfield by a unfulfilled office seeker. And so we move into another realm of American bureaucracy that we call sort of the progressive system, a system that was based on competency, not political support or patronage. So competency then at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century becomes the basis. This idea was to promote those who are best able to serve. For example, if you were going to be the postmaster general, you should know something about the mail, know something about the mail service, know something about the needs of the country in terms of postal services as well. And so we created in 1883 the Pendleton Act, which created this merit system, this progressive system of bureaucratic employment. And this was meant to get rid of the unresponsive and the purely political appointees. And also at the same time, they created a number of regulatory commissions to oversee the whole civil service system. And we moved from a purely patronage system to a merit-based or civil service system. This is what it was called, the merit civil service system. The merit civil service system revolutionized American bureaucracy, stressing competency over political allegiance. Well, let's talk briefly about some theories of bureaucracy. Now, granted, bureaucracy is not the most engaging, exciting part of American politics, but it's an important part. It affects every American's life. It affects our welfare as a country, so we have to study it. There are a number of great theories of bureaucracy. One of them is the German sociologist Max Weber. Weber's idea that democracy was important in all modern societies, and that the more effective a bureaucracy was usually dependent on how well organized it was. You had to have definite structures, and with each level reporting to another level, and that level reporting yet to another level. And so you had to have a definitive leadership structure in bureaucracy. And that Weber also said that each level depended on greater specialization. And so each level would have a more refined role and function within the organization. And this established what the authority of bureaucracy would be. And he talked about different kinds of bureaucracies. He had a model of traditional bureaucracy, charismatic bureaucracy, and pure bureaucracy. An alternative to Weber is the Austrian economist of the 20th century, Ludwig von Mises. And von Mises argued that bureaucracy in the Weberian format was inefficient, that was doomed to failure because it just created larger and larger systems of management that really just encouraged the growth of each other. If you want to increase your bureaucracy, just become more specialized over time. What von Mises argued, and is still a very powerful argument today, is that bureaucracy must restrain itself. While there needs to be a leadership structure, it itself needs to be as refined as possible. So von Mises' argument is for a much smaller bureaucracy based on efficiency, not specialization. Weber, probably the most famous student of bureaucracy, argues for a system based on specialization. Okay. Bureaucracy is part of American life. We cannot get away from it. It is involved in almost everything that we do, both in government and in the private sector. What we want to do is, IBM has a bureaucracy, Microsoft has a bureaucracy, Coca-Cola has a bureaucracy, PepsiCo, the owner of the Pepsi, Taco Bell, and others, they have their own bureaucracy. What we want to talk about is the difference between public bureaucracies, like the American national governmental bureaucracy, and private bureaucracies. Let's look at a few of the key differences between public and private. One of the most important differences is that the American national government bureaucracy is the bureaucracy of the American people. It must be open. So the first goal is openness. You have access to that bureaucracy. You have access to the decisions that it's made. You have access to its budget. You have the ability to question its decisions. As compared to a private entity like Microsoft, that we do not have access to their decisions. They're a private corporation. They haven't been elected. They don't report to the American people. And so we don't have access to that kind of information. There are many particular pieces of legislation, for example, that will allow you to see in American life, that have allowed us to see what government does. One of those is the Administrative Procedures Act of 1946. And very famously in California began a trend with the passage of the Sunshine Act of 1977 that basically government cannot have private meetings unless they involve specific personnel issues. All of the government meetings need to be held in an open, free area. Anybody can come, anybody can make a comment. Probably the most famous in terms of the national government is the Freedom of Information Act of 1966, which allows individual citizens, especially the media, who are most likely to make use of this, access to all government documents. And this was a very, very important advancement in terms of citizens requesting responsiveness and information about the government. There are over 500,000 requests of the Freedom of Information Act every year. And some of these are very serious inquiries into what government is doing and how government has done things in the past. There was for example, thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, we have the FBI file of Dr. Martin Luther King and Elvis Presley. And we have access to that kind of information to see that the government probably was collecting much more information on those figures and many others than the government probably needed to collect. But it's all there. A friend of mine in our department of political science has a FBI file, and he, through the Freedom of Information Act, requested a copy of his file. And this is a fairly mild-mannered, sort of innocent fellow, and I was really surprised to see that he had a 30-page FBI file. He hasn't really committed any crime, but he engaged in some activities that brought some suspicion towards him. So he requested a copy of his file. A second area of difference between public and private bureaucracy is of fairness. Public bureaucracies have to use some kind of fairness guide to make sure that all citizens, for example, if they want to do some work for the government, have access to government contracts. Private corporations don't have those same kind of limitations. So if you want to work for the government, the national government and most state governments, you'll have to compete with other individuals and corporations that have certain rules that you have to follow. Thirdly, the consideration that separates public bureaucracies, the American national government, state governments, and local municipalities from private corporations and private bureaucracies is that of honesty. We hold the government and its bureaucracy accountable for the decisions that they make. And that's a very, very important distinction. Okay, the last survey we want to look at is the different types of bureaucracy. In terms of the American national government, there are about 5 basic types, and our textbook surveys these, but I just want to mention them. The first is the EOP, the Executive Office of the President. These are the people the President appoints. They do not have to be confirmed by the Senate for the most part, just a few of them do, and they report directly to the President. They also serve at the President's leisure. When the President leaves office, these folks are typically go back to the private sector, go back to some other job, but they serve at the President's leisure. The major piece of American government bureaucracy is what we call the departments. There are 15 departments in the United States government. These are surveyed in our textbook. All are not equal. Some are much larger. Department of Defense, Health and Human Services are giant bureaucracies in themselves. You've already read about this, of course. But these are very major appointments. The head of each one of those departments is appointed by the President. And we know this from Article 1 and Article 2 of the Constitution, although it doesn't describe any of these, the creation of these departments. They were all, of course, created after the Constitution was ratified. These 15 departments form basically the national government bureaucracy. Department of State, Department of Defense, which is actually called the Department of War before the 20th century. These 15, the most recent Department of Homeland Security, coming after September 11, 2001. These department secretaries and their various assistant secretaries, deputy secretaries, in each one of those 15 departments, they all are appointed by the President, but they have to be confirmed, as we know in Article 1, by the Senate, not the House. The House is not involved. So you have presidential proposal, senatorial disposal of these nominations. So the President appoints, the Senate confirms. So these are the 15 departments, and it's very important to know all of those 15 as part of this class, I would recommend. Next is what we call independent agencies. Now, these independent agencies serve a variety of functions. Some of those functions, but they're usually typically regulatory and administrative in nature. They are not all the same. And I don't want to, it's not at this time probably worthwhile for us to go into a large discussion of them, but they serve a regulatory function. And they for example, NASA, which has one goal, and that's the National Space Program. Unlike the 15 cabinet departments that sometimes cover hundreds of issues and programs, sometimes thousands. The last type and the smallest type of government agency is what we call the quasi-governmental agency. These are agencies that are basically public corporations with government supervision. Typically, Congress appoints a board of these for these agencies, but they function as a private corporation, even though they're under the direct supervision of Congress. One that probably has touched your life the most is the United States Postal Service, which is a quasi-governmental organization. It can actually make a profit. It's not now, as you know, and has some very serious challenges. Another is the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, that responded in the early part of the 20th century to severe flooding and weather conditions in that very long Tennessee Valley in the eastern part of the United States. It is basically a private corporation, but it is under the direct supervision of Congress. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a survey of some of the major issues related to bureaucracy. Please take some time, read the text closely, and I look forward to seeing your reflections on this very, very important and constantly vigilant issue. Thank you.